Okay, everybody. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to take you through the remainder of the handout for our discussion of the first three chapters of part 2 of Susanna Siegel's Rationality of Perception. In particular, I'm going to begin with chapter 5. We in class did a first pass at the main argument that I outlined for you on pages 3 and 4 of the handout, but I'm going to go over that again just to make sure it's super clear, because I think it's important to understand the argument that she's making. So the first premise of the argument, which can be found on the bottom of the third page of your handout, is the following. Perceptual experiences are the result of a specific sort of inference. And in the preceding discussion, we'll talk about what that kind of inference is. But in the meantime, that's just a hypothesis that she's working with, and she's argued for that premise already by trying to show that there's nothing about the nature of perception that prevents it from being the result of an inference. And then in this chapter, she'll argue that there's nothing in the nature of inference that prevents perceptions from being parts of inferences, namely conclusions. So the support for this premise, this first premise, will come in two parts. One we've already read, that was chapter 3, and then the rest of the support for this premise will come in the current chapter. The second premise is a definition that we've been quite hungry for in our discussion so far. It's a preliminary definition of what an inference is, and it's couched at a level of generality that it's doing a lot of good work here. And the definition goes like this, premise 2. Inferences are systematic relationships from informational states to conclusions arrived at by subjects about that information. So an inference is just about movement from an information-bearing state to a conclusion about that information by a subject, where that movement from informational state to conclusion is something that still needs to be fully explained. So now we are going to conditionalize on the basis of premise 2. Premise 3 says, if inferences are systematic relations from informational states to conclusions arrived at by subjects about that information, if that's the case, so if premise 2 is true, then the following is true. Inferences are rationally evaluable. Why? Because the cognitive journey from an information-bearing state to a conclusion about that information can go well or badly. And if it can go well or badly, better or worse, then it's evaluable. You can evaluate someone's cognitive conduct. And that's the definition of rationality. So the first conclusion is a conclusion about the nature of inference. A very uncontroversial conclusion, to be sure. Namely, that inferences are rationally evaluable because the cognitive journey from information to conclusion can go well or badly. But now we're going to take that information and we're going to conditionalize again. If inferences are rationally evaluable, then their conclusions are rationally evaluable, because the conclusion just is the place where the journey ends. So if the entire inference is evaluable, then the component that concludes the inference is evaluable. But now we combine that premise with our first premise, which is that perceptions are conclusions of inferences. And we get two conclusions. First is the conclusion that, of course, inferences are rationally evaluable. And the second conclusion is that perceptual experiences are rationally evaluable. So actually, looking at that argument, we can cross out premise 5. Premise 5 is redundant. It's embodied in premise in the first conclusion. That's right. Okay, so that's the argument. We make a claim about the rational evaluability of inferences. We make a claim about perceptions being the conclusion of inferences. And then we make a claim about perceptions being rationally evaluable. Okay, so now we can start to unpack this notion of inference. We can start to think more carefully about what an inference is and how it works. And as we mentioned in class, on first blush, it might look like an inference is synonymous with reasoning or thinking. Siegel will call it reckoning. And if that were true, if it were true that inference just is a kind of thinking or reckoning, then the view that perception is the result of an inference would immediately succumb to an objection of over-intellectualization. That is, perception is not the result of thinking. Perception is a passive process that happens to many creatures that are not capable of higher order thought. Therefore, any view of perception that says that it is the result of that kind of cognitive activity will be false. Siegel is sensitive to this. So now what she's going to want to do is develop an account of inference that does not succumb to the objection of over-intellectualization. So her first pass at a positive characterization of inference over and above the what we call the relational conception, that is that an inference is simply a relation between an information-bearing state and a conclusion a subject comes to about that state, is what she calls the response hypothesis, which is on page 77 of the text. And this is the view that inferring, and I'm reading now from the handout, page 4, that inferring is a distinctive kind of response to an informational state or to a combination of such states that produces a conclusion. An informational state can take the form of a belief, but it can also take the form of a perceptual experience, a supposition, or an attitude. So it's the trick here about distinguishing between different sorts of inferences and trying to come up with an account of inference that will be suitable for being the psychological precursor to a perceptual experience will resolve around an explanation of what a response is, different kinds of responses. So one kind of response that you can have to an information state is to reckon about it, to think about it, to contemplate it. And this is what Siegel will call the main model for inferring, and one that she is at pains to reject for reasons we've already explained. Before we fully unpack that contrast, Siegel's going to outline 3 starting assumptions about the nature of inference that any account of inference will have to meet. So the first assumption, and this is at the bottom of page 4 of your handout, is that inferences are psychological acts that have an epistemic upshot. That is, they're an activity of the mind, and that that activity has an epistemic upshot. That activity can be performed better or worse, and depending on whether it's performed better or worse, will have an impact on your rational standing, on your knowledge base, on your credence. So this epistemic upshot, inferences have this epistemic upshot. They're psychological acts that have an epistemic upshot by creating a dependence between a conclusion on an input, the proper or improper connection of which bears on the subject's rational standing. So if the connection between the conclusion and the input is proper or well-formed, then the subject's rational standing will be maintained or improved. If the connection between the conclusion and the input is ill-formed or unjustified, then the subject's rational standing will be diminished. Second assumption. Inferential processes can happen outside of self-awareness. This is very important. So here's a quote. The quote reads, "The process of inferring doesn't have to feel like anything. You don't necessarily have to think anything to yourself in inner speech or otherwise. You don't have to rehearse the reasoning that brought you to that conclusion." So here's some examples. Walking around a puddle, or a child playing hide and seek and making decisions about where to look. When I walk around a puddle, arguably what I'm doing is I'm taking in information about my environment, and then I'm forming a conclusion about how I ought to behave such that I can avoid the puddle by moving around it. Now, when I see the puddle and walk around it, I do not have an explicit feeling or entertain an inner speech that says, that water puddle is going to make my feet wet if I walk through it. I don't want my feet to get wet, therefore I will walk around it. That kind of thought process just doesn't occur in those sorts of perceptual circumstances. We just sort of skillfully adapt. And yet, we might say that in this case, it's not unreasonable to characterize the cognitive processes that yield that adaptive behavior as a kind of conclusion formed on the basis of interpreting an information-bearing state. In this example, an information-bearing state about the location of a puddle. Third assumption. Inferences aren't that complicated. Here's a quote. "These inferences do not involve any more cognitive sophistication than what's needed to play hide and seek or to help keep one's feet dry. Yet it is clear that the thinkers in these cases end up at a conclusion by responding to information they have, and that the conclusion epistemically depends on the information they respond to. So now, with those three assumptions on the table, it should become much clearer to us now how we might start to wed inference to perception. That is, the kinds of practical problems we solve every day can be thought of as being solved as the result of a successful inferential process, and that these processes underwrite our basic perceptual exploration of our environment. So in summary, Siegel says the following. The notion of inference that includes all three assumptions denotes a kind of epistemic dependence that does not stand or fall with the subject's consciousness of drawing a conclusion or with the reconstructibility into epistemically relevant semantic and logical relations between propositions. What does that mean? It means we can give a positive articulation of what an inference is, and that inference's positive articulation does not depend on us being self-aware about the process of inference, about the movement that we make cognitively from an information state to a conclusion. That can happen completely outside of our self-awareness. And furthermore, and arguably more importantly, that a subject, their response that connects the information from the information state to the conclusion, that can happen in a way that has nothing to do with reconstructing the actual movement in the mind from information state to conclusion in terms of semantic or logical relations between propositions. That is, it's not like, as we talked about in class, the explicit deduction of a conclusion from formulated premises that we entertain or reckon with to ourselves. That kind of cognitive complexity of the inner life, of the intellectual inner life, is not necessary for a positive conception of what an inference is. And because of that, it looks like Siegel will be able to avoid the charge of over-intellectualization. But at this point, now, we can ask a question. And the question is the following. This is the middle of the 5th page of your handout, okay? The question is the following. If an inference is a systematic connection between an information-bearing state had by a subject and a conclusion arrived at by that subject regarding that very information, then what is the nature of the subject's response that connects that information, the information relevant to the conclusion, to that very conclusion? What's the glue? What's the glue between these two? The answer is a little bit frustrating, to be honest. Because what Siegel says is that the notion of a response can be brought further into focus by contrasting it with 6 different relations that a subject could stand into psychological states that are distinct from inferentially responding to them. So what she's going to do is say, here are 6 different ways, grouped in 3 headings, that we move from one state to another. From an information, from an information-bearing state to a conclusion, that are non-inferential, that aren't what we want. And so we can, what I say on your handout here is that Siegel is going to proceed to individuate by way of contrast. She's going to form a contrast class and say, not like this. So the first group is what we will call failures to respond. So this is what happens. So the first one is called mentally jogging, and the second is called bypassing. Mentally jogging is when you arrive at a conclusion without that conclusion being in any way related to the information that's available to you. So you just kind of happened upon a conviction. Groundless opinions are an example of this. Okay, it's just what I think. It's just my opinion. Okay. Bypassing is a specific subset of mental jogging, where it's a kind of mental jogging where the information that does not bear on the conclusion is relevant to it. So it's when you have information that's relevant to your conclusion, but you run around it. You don't. That information does not bear on your movement from to a conclusion, even though that information is available to you. Okay. Then we have another group, which is responses to non-informational states. The examples here are what she calls rhythm and rhyme and association. So rhythm and rhyme is what happens when the cadence and of your inner speech creates transitions in informational states where the resulting state is in no way a response to the first. So, this is what happens when rhyming words cause you to make transitions in your thoughts from, thinking, I like to play the drum, to you have a smelly bum. These are the kinds of things that kids like to do, where they like pick up on funny little rhyming overlaps in words and then use those overlaps as an excuse to transition very abruptly from something relevant to something irrelevant. So that's what we will call rhythm and rhyme. And then association is when we respond to concepts rather than information. What does that mean? Well, the idea is just that there is no constraint. There's no rational constraint on the transition between concepts. So we can just think certain thoughts that are associated with other thoughts, but there's no rational evaluable content in the transition from one thought to the next. Then we have non-inferential responses. So one is constructing a narrative, the other is attention. So constructing a narrative is where a resulting state is a story that we construct on the basis of a first state, but this on the basis relation is not a response that makes the resulting state a conclusion based on the first. And then attention, one's attention is directed to something, thus forming a new state on the basis of a previous state. And what she says about all of these six is that on the face of it, what's lacking from these cases is a distinctive way of responding to the Q state that produces a P state. These transitions fail to be inferences because they lack a certain kind of response, where we end up in the conclusion is a result of a systematic relationship between the concluding state and an information-bearing state that the conclusion is about. So now we're in a position to draw a pretty strong contrast between what we'll call the reckoning model of inference, the model of inference that thinks about inferences as a kind of explicit, self-conscious, propositional, intellectual activity, and minimal inferences, which are the kinds of inferences that will function as the psychological precursors for perceptual experience. So Siegel points out on page 93 that the reckoning model of inference has two basic parts. The first is that inferences of this sort are a response to inputs that make it the case that those inputs count as supporting the conclusion for the subject. And this is going to be true of a lot of inferences, not just these reckoning inferences. But the second part is more important for individuating reckoning inferences from other inferences. The second point is that a subject's being in the reckoning state explains why she reaches the conclusion that she does. Reckoning and concluding are two different parts of the inferring process. And her quote says here, the relation between the reckoning state and the conclusion is the causal relation. One concludes because one reckons. It is the reckoning that connects the premise or the information state to the conclusion. So now she's going to give an argument for why reckoning is not needed for inference. And it's a very simple argument. It's a very simple argument. And it's an argument by counterexample. So I'll give you the formal argument and then we'll go through the four counterexamples. So here's the argument. There are at least four types of inferences that do not require reckoning. But if there are types of inferences that don't require reckoning, then reckoning is not needed for inference. Therefore, reckoning is not needed for inference. And then she outlines the four kinds of inference. This is the top of page 7. Categorization, the example of which is the kind postal worker scenario. Responding to aggregated factors, that's the pepperoni pizza. Spatiotemporal calculation, that's walking in nature too far north and then course correcting. And then searches for information when we bite down on something hard. So I'm not going to unpack each of those examples. That's something we can do in class together if we want to go a little bit deeper into this. These are all on page 93 to 97. And the summary of this is what really matters. It says, in these cases, categorization, responding to aggregated factors, spatiotemporal calculation, and searches for information. In such cases, the subjects respond to some information that they have by forming a belief. And in the pepperoni case, a desire and an aversion as well. But subjects draw conclusions from information they have, and those conclusions depend on the information epistemically. But none of these cases can involve a reckoning state because the subjects themselves cannot identify the information to which they are responding in the following sense. There is no X such that the subjects know they are responding to X informing the belief or desire. So what this means is that the subjects come to conclusions without understanding explicitly how they got to those conclusions. So if that's the case, then those are counterexamples to the reckoning model of inference. Okay? So here's a summary argument for how she's argued so far. Nothing in the nature of perception precludes perceptions being formed by inferential processes. That was what she argued in chapter 3. And what she argued in this chapter, chapter 5, is that nothing in the nature of inferences preclude perceptions being formed by inferential processes. Then we have independent reason for thinking that perceptual experiences harbor epistemic powers, namely hijacked experiences. And inference, we know, is a straightforward model for how states of various sorts harbor epistemic powers. Therefore, it follows that inference is a straightforward model for how perceptual experiences harbor epistemic powers. Now, the important thing about this argument is to recognize that it is just an argument that there are no, as yet, good reasons to deny the picture that Siegel wants to defend. So she's arguing against people who would object. But in the next chapter, what's going to happen is she's going to offer a positive argument for her view. So it's not enough just to say, there's no good reason to deny it, that's fine, but that's not yet to tell me that to argue that it's true, that it's a good view. So she's going to do that in the next chapter. So here Siegel is going to talk about the inferential modulation thesis, which came alongside the epistemic charge thesis at the beginning of chapter 1. This is the view that experiences can be formed by inferences that modulate their epistemic charge. So here's the argument, bottom of page 7. It goes like this. If perceptual experiences can result from inferences, then the epistemic effects of inference will be the effects of the epistemic powers of perceptual experience. Sorry, let me read that one more time. If perceptual experiences can result from inferences, then the epistemic effects of inference will be the effects on the epistemic powers of perceptual experience. Second premise, perceptual experiences can result from inferences. Therefore, the epistemic effects of inference will be the effects on the epistemic powers of perceptual experience. So premise 2 is the one that needs the most argument. And the way she's going to argue for premise 2 is to look at 3 kinds of inappropriate inference and how such inferences would bear on their attendant perceptual experiences. So here's a quote. When an experience is epistemically downgraded as a result of a poor inference, its epistemic powers fall below the baseline and the experience is negatively epistemically charged. So here are 3 kinds of inappropriate inference. The first is what we call inherited inappropriateness. So she's going to use belief as the model here because that's more straightforward, but we're going to apply these inappropriate inferences to perceptions. If belief Y is epistemically inappropriate, a subsequent belief Z inferred from Y may inherit Y's inappropriateness. Jumping to conclusions. You infer Q from P in an inference to a Q state from a P state, but P doesn't support Q. So you jump to a conclusion on the basis of inadequate evidence. Circularity. For some roles of X in inferentially supporting a conclusion Y cannot provide rational support for X. If Y is strengthened in response to X, then Y is epistemically inappropriate. So here's the upshot. If an experience inherited inappropriateness from inferential inputs or resulted from jumping to conclusions from inferential inputs, then it will be formed in ways that are epistemically inappropriate. So this is her way of saying, look, we are perfectly within our bounds to think that our perceptual experiences, insofar as we have independent reasons for thinking they can be formed by inferences, inherit the epistemic charge or the epistemic power of the inference that formed it. The primary scenario that we've been entertaining thus far has been in terms of epistemic downgrade. Right? We've been thinking about all the ways that experience goes wrong. But the point that is important to keep in mind looking forward here is that if there's a baseline of common sense where perception is good reason for belief, and we have reason to think that it's possible to fall short of the baseline, then it might be possible to go above and beyond the baseline. That is, it might be possible to have inferential processes that serve perception that make our perceptions more reliable than simple common sense, right? Because common sense is reliable enough, but it's fallible. But it's possible to think that there could be epistemic upgrade to perception if the kinds of inferential chains that lead to the perception are of the right sort. So that will be where we pick up on Wednesday, is we'll think about what it might be and why we might want to think that a perception could be epistemically upgraded from the baseline above the credence thresholds of common sense. And until then, I'm going to stop. This will be a short lecture, but we will spend as much time as we need on Wednesday just working through any and all questions you might have about the remaining material from today's discussion. And then from there, we'll move on to our discussion of part 3. Okay, see you all soon.